I hope you all are having a wonderful week. My name is Yupari and I'd like to welcome you into this week's portrait painting demonstration. And in this week's video, we're going to be using water-soluble oil paints. So we're going to be using oil paints that can be diluted with water. And I really did like using these water-soluble oil paints. So here you're seeing the finished painting and the brushes that I used. So just to show you how easily the brushes can clean with the water. Look at this brush. The paint is just coming right off of it. It's pretty amazing what these scientists did with this water-soluble oil paint. The paint just falls right off. And for my medium, I'd like to thank Carlos Taylor, a friend of mine, who suggested I use cooking oil as a medium. So here we have just regular olive oil, and that's going to be what I'll be using for my medium. Just olive oil and water as my thinner. And here we have our model Haley, and I'm going to keep an image of her to the top left corner of the screen so you can refer to it as I develop the painting. I'm going to start off by listing the colors, so I'll be using Zinc White, Burnt Umber, Cadmium Red, Yellow Ochre, Cadmium Yellow, Ultramarine Blue, and Ivory Black. So I'm going to start off with a size 1 round brush, and I'm going to be diluting the paint with the olive oil. So this is just burnt umber and olive oil with the water solubles, and I'm working on a cotton canvas, a 9x12 cotton canvas, and I gessoed this canvas probably about 3 or 4 times just to make the surface a little bit more absorbent. And so that's one thing I will note with the water soluble oil paints. You really want a very absorbent surface. I tried filming while painting on a panel like I usually do with the regular oil paints, and I didn't really like the panel. And so we have just a very basic block in here. So I have just a indication for where I want the portrait to be placed. And if you're wondering, the audio is a little bit different. And so I'm actually kind of using my old style. So this is going to be voiceover style. I did try to change up my camera angle and microphone setup, but the microphone that I had before didn't really work that well. So for now, I'm going to stick with this style until I can get a better clip-on microphone. But in any case, just with a few simple straight lines and angles, you can already see the shape of the head start to develop on the canvas. Now, the important thing is to say as much as you can with the least amount of information that you can. Now, sometimes you'll see me start off with just color and large masses of color and then sculpting the forms from there. Other times you've seen me draw with charcoal and then transfer the image. But this is really kind of my preferred way of working. So let's just call this the Umber sketch. So very quickly, I'm just indicating where I want the portrait to fit. And I'm not trying to get a perfect outline just yet. I just have a rough indication of the shoulder. You see a little brush stroke there for the shoulder. And then now I'm going to start to draw in my center line. So this center line is going to be vital towards getting an idea of where the head is going to be turned relative to me. So I just adjusted the center line. I really want to make sure that I get that angle right. So I'm going to hold up a plumb line just to compare the distances here. So that line right there is extremely important in terms of orienting the features properly. So now the next thing I'm going to do is put in a axis for the eyes. And just a big rectangular shape here to encompass both eye sockets all in one fell swoop. So this is going to be kind of like an architectural starting point for the rest of the features to fit. And now I'm going to put in a little smudge here for where the nose is going to fit. And I'm going to do the same thing right here with the mouth. Very simple. and abstract. And with the water solubles, I'm going to keep talking a little bit about the materials. So it's going to be important, and I'm going to emphasize this throughout the entire painting. Do not try to thin out the water soluble oil paint with water. Just use the water to clean the brush, and it is very effective at cleaning the brush. Now I'm going to be using a paper towel with just a little bit of water here, and I'm going to use it to kind of erase. So we're going to use water, a little bit of water into a tiny bit of paper towel, and that's going to be our eraser. I would not advise trying to use an eraser brush with this technique of the water solubles. Now, if you've seen my other videos where I start in this way with regular oil paints, I usually have a little bit of mineral spirits on another brush and I use that as an eraser brush. Not the case with this one. With this one, it's going to be very important to thin out the paint with the olive oil. Now, I will say that I'm not entirely sure about the conservatory aspect of using cooking oil. Now, they do make very specific mediums like refined linseed oil to thin out the water solubles, but I just wanted to try it. I just wanted to try using cooking oil as a medium, and I really liked it. I will say that cooking oil is a slow dryer. Well, maybe it's that particular olive oil that I'm using. Let's just say that olive oil, I guess, is a slow dryer with these water solubles. And if you want to know exactly which paints that I'm using, that information will be typed in the description below. So right now, all we have is the abstract. So I'm working with simple shapes, and let's call these shapes stand-ins. So each feature has its relative stand-in. So it is a shape, a simple shape that is standing in place for where I'm guessing that the features are going to fit. So I like to work using comparative measurement rather than sight size. Sight size is where you have the model or the image right next to the painting. In this circumstance, you can tell on the corner of the screen here that I don't have a picture right next to my canvas. Rather, I'm comparatively measuring the proportions in relation to one another. So that is, I have a smudge for one eye socket here, and then I have basically a smudge for the other eye socket, and a smudge for the nose, and a smudge for the mouth. Now with the eraser and with the burnt umber color, all I'm doing is adjusting these simple shapes in relation to one another. And by doing so, I'm constantly stepping back to see how these shapes fit in relation to the model. Now I noticed that I had the mouth a little bit off, which is okay. It's important to keep these shapes as simplistic as possible because something like that will happen. You're going to get to a point where you're going to want to move certain objects, and you want to liberate that brush. You want to work freely. As the artist Nelson Shanks is quoted saying, "Find form with freedom." And that's what we're doing here. I'm holding the brush. You can see I'm holding the brush at the end. And I'm moving through my arm, meaning I'm not holding the brush kind of like a pencil. I'm holding the brush right there. You can see from the furthest distance away that I possibly can. And I'm making very bold straight lines and angles to try to figure out where everything fits in relation to one another. So you want to work as freely as possible, especially in the beginning. And in the beginning, you really don't want to have that mentality or that fear that you're painting your friend, you're painting a family member, whoever you're painting. Sometimes it can be kind of terrifying because you're afraid to insult the model, or you're afraid that you won't be able to get a likeness. Now, that kind of fear really tends to hold back a lot of artists, and we should be brave. be as brave as possible, simplify as much as we can, and to own our materials. You really want to own your materials. And with the water solubles, I tell you what, it erases very similarly. You can tell here, it's erasing extremely similar to the regular oil paints. And other than the fact that it diluted with water, it's handling extremely similar to regular oil paints. Notice here with a little more paint and a little more pressure, I'm putting down some dark accents for where the dark shapes of the eye are going to fit. One on one side and then on the corresponding side. And I'm going to be trying to stand back as much as I can to see how these shapes are fitting with one another. Nevertheless, I was very surprised with the water-soluble oil paints, and at first I really didn't like them. I'm going to be honest with you, at first I really did not know how to use them, and that was because with regular oil paints, I have a tendency to use a lot of the mineral spirits to get the paint to flow. Now with water-soluble, at least with this brand, it's not as thick, so it doesn't really take much to get the paint to flow. So that's why with just a little bit of the olive oil, I'm able to loosely draw onto the surface as I would with regular oil paint. So now I'm starting to erase a little shape here for where I think that the light of the eyes are going to fit. So I'm erasing little angles and trying to refine the simple shape that I have. So now I'm going to put in a little dark shape there for where I think that the pupil is going to fit. So I guess that pupil is going to fit right there. So I'm going to move to the other side here to see if this pupil on the other side fits well correspondingly to the other side. So you always want to work one side in relation to the other side. I guarantee you, working on one side of the face and then moving to the other side of the face is usually not a good idea. I think it's a better idea to work from one side to the other side. Notice I put in a little shape for the bottom eyelid on the left side, and then I put the shape on the right side. So now we're going to add a little bit more refinement to these shapes here. Now the goal with the burnt umber sketch, or the burnt umber architecture, if you will, is to get the drawing correct in terms of two tones, light and shadow, and throwing in some half tones here and there is it's all right. But primarily the large shapes of light and dark. So I'm actually going to use a clean brush. So now I'm holding up a horizontal line. So I'm going to be using a clean brush as well to kind of stump the dark shapes together. So kind of like a stump with charcoal. And I'll also use it to push the shapes around a little bit. And I'm also going to still use this little piece of paper towel. So making sure that the angle between the two eyes is correct is invaluable at this stage. And so that's going to be my main focus, is to make sure that with each individual modification that I'm doing, such as adding a little bit of light here to this area of the eye, I want to make sure that that angle between the two eyes is as accurate as it can possibly be. So now I'm going to paint in a little bit of dark right here on the corner of the right side of the eye, and just a little simple brush stroke there ought to do the trick. And I don't really want to do anything more than just 4 simple brush strokes for the placement of one eye. You really want to work with intention, but be as simplistic as possible. So now I'm holding up a plumb line, a vertical plumb line, to compare where the corner of the eye is fitting in relation to the nose. And it's a good idea to close one eye and hold up a vertical plumb line. And a plumb line just refers to a vertical line. It's important to use those plumb lines because the eye tends to have a bias towards the left or a bias towards the right. So for me, my eyes have a bias towards the right, according to my eye doctor. So I definitely have to close my left eye whenever I'm trying to see vertical measurements. And it's natural. I would think that everyone kind of has a little bias from one eye to the other. So now with this brush here, this is the clean brush that I was talking about. So I'm using it kind of to facilitate the drawing, just to push some of the shapes either up or down, and then going back in with the other brush that has just the burnt umber. And just a simple shape like this will be very useful for me in terms of gauging how far down the nose needs to go in relation to that center line. So now I'm putting a little corner there for the side of the nose just to see where that angle fits. Now I'm trying to figure out where the bulb of the nose is going to fit. That is the center of the nose. In the bottom we have the little nostril there, but I don't want to put any kind of details. I don't want nostrils, eyelashes, or anything like that. Just simple abstract shapes. Practice these simple abstract shapes and be honest with yourself. Stand back, bounce your eyes back and forth from the painting to the model. Use these horizontal lines and also use diagonal lines. Now I'm using a diagonal line from each axis, that is the axis of the nose, the eyes, and the mouth, just to make sure that they sort of line up in relation to the model. So now with the dry brush, I'm pushing up a little bit, and I'm going to smudge a little bit on the corner here. See this dark light here? So this is just going to give me kind of like a halftone. I'm prematurely putting in a halftone there, but it's all right. Sometimes I like to throw in a little halftone in the Umber drawing or Umber sketch stage, whatever you want to refer to this stage at. So with a little vertical gesture here, I'm going to make a little place marker for the corner of one side of the mouth, and I'm going to do the same thing with the other side of the mouth. With each individual brush stroke, standing back is going to be invaluable, especially in this stage where you're trying to find the major patterns of light and dark. Now I'm going to work a little bit of the outside shape. I think this corner might need to cut in a little bit, not entirely sure. But each stage of the painting will be refined, or with each stage of this painting, the drawing will be refined further and further. So that is when we get into the color. Notice here I'm kind of pushing out a little shape here for the corner of the eye socket. But when we get into color, we're going to start to add in some more of the planes. So the reason that we're working with these straight lines and angles is so that when we get into color, we can translate that two-dimensional concept of a straight line and an angle into a three-dimensional concept that we can refer to as a plane. So each little chop, if you will, right here, a little corner of the chin, each little two-dimensional angle or relation in terms of the shape is going to then be extended into three-dimensional thinking when we get into the planes. Each corner of the light and dark shapes can then be extended to values. Notice how I kind of did that there. I smudged the bottom of the chin. Again, I'm adding in some plane changes and some value changes in here, kind of in a premature fashion, but you can see from that brush stroke how the corner of the ramus of the jaw is turning, that the value did get darker closer to that brush stroke, because that angle is indicating to me that it is turning further away from the light, therefore getting a little bit darker. So now we're going to use the dry brush to smudge in a little shape here, and now let's just extend it a little bit to the cheekbone. So that's the zygomatic region of the bone right here. So this area is the cheekbone. So zygomatic is just a cool way of saying cheekbone. So that is that angle right there. See that angle on the corner of the side of the face? That straight line is giving me an angle, which then translates to a three-dimensional concept, which will be the plane of the cheekbone. So we used a horizontal line right there to figure out where we wanted the ear to fit. And again, keeping your shapes as simple as possible, especially at this stage, using straight lines and angles is going to be a very useful tool for trying to build onto the accuracy of the painting. Now, as far as accuracy is concerned with the drawing, yes, there will be people saying that you must get your proportions as perfectly placed as possible, or they will criticize you saying, oh, your drawing is not right. Well, I'll tell you what. Paint whatever you want to paint. Paint however you want to paint. Just because one person says something doesn't mean that that is the law. Doesn't mean that that is how things should be done, especially when you're just trying to enjoy yourself, when you're trying to enjoy painting. So on that note, the accuracy of the drawing, if you think of each little shape, each placement for the eyes, the nose right here, the mouth, the ears, there is an acceptable range of error, especially with portrait painting. Say you get the drawing about 92% correct. Not to think about it like a passing grade, but if you get your shapes within maybe a 92% or 85 maybe percent accuracy, you can create a beautiful painting. And hey, we can change the numbers depending on the type of portrait you want to paint. If you want to paint a more abstract or a more impressionistic portrait, then by all means. So now that we have the light and dark shapes as accurately drawn in as we possibly can, now let's get into color. So I'm going to be using a size 1 round brush, and I'm using a combination of the Cadmium Red, the yellow ochre, and the Zinc White. So the Zinc White is a transparent white, the same transparency that I noticed in the Zinc White with regular oil paints actually translates pretty well to the water solubles. That is a very nice transparent white. And again, if you want to know exactly which materials I'm using, that information is typed in the description box below. Just scroll down and you will see exactly what paint tubes, what manufacturers that I used. And so remember the straight lines and angles that we used in the block-in? Remember how I said that that was going to translate to a three-dimensional thinking, which is the planar thinking? That's what we're doing. So now on the forehead, you're seeing just two planes. One plane that's lighter, one plane that's darker. Notice the shape on the outside of the forehead. The corner right here, this corner on the side is turning away from the light. If we imagine that the light is facing the model's forehead a little bit more than it is facing the side of the model's head. So the planes that are being hit most directly by the sunlight are going to be the planes that are going to be lighter. Imagine you're sitting at the beach at noon and you're getting a suntan, and maybe you forgot to put sunblock on your nose or your cheeks. And then you go home, and then all of a sudden your nose and your cheeks are sunburned. Why did that happen? Well, the sunlight, the angle of the light was hitting right here on your forehead more than it was the side of your face. So the planes of your nose and the planes on your forehead and your cheeks were being hit more directly by the sunlight, and that is why you received that sunburn. So that same kind of thinking we're extending here. Here's another plane on the corner of the forehead. So there's going to be kind of a round shape to the front of the forehead here. So you're going to kind of see the structure of the skull. And right here on this corner, there's a light here on the frontal ridge of the skull. So this little area here is going to be a structure that's going to be receiving a lot of light. And then it's going to be receiving less light as the plane angles further away to the side of the forehead. So this area right here is another plane that's turning further away from the light. So it is getting darker. And then as we move further and further down, it's going to be receiving even less light as we approach the nose. But then once we get to the nose, we will be receiving more light. So about the consistency of the paint, there is a little difference in the consistency of this water-soluble paint. I think that it's safer to use less medium with water solubles than with regular oil paints. So I'll say that again. Using less medium will give you a more naturalistic result in terms of the application of the paint. Now, as I start to build these large planes and these value relationships, my first pass, such as this pass right here on the glabella, so the glabella is the plane right in between the two eye sockets, is going to be rather thin. And then I'm going to apply more and more paint onto it. But at this stage, I'm using little to no medium. So the olive oil, the thinner that I was using before, and that I mentioned before, I'm only going to use very sparingly. And pretty much almost none of it is going to go into the face. Only some of it is going to go into the background. I had to use the olive oil to thin out the burnt umber for the initial drawing, but as I develop these planes, I'm using little to no medium. Now, the consistency of these water-soluble paints is a lot thinner. I don't know how to describe it. I think you can think of it as closer to that of like melted butter. But if you cake on the water solubles, it's not as friendly to work with. So working with more transparent layers like this and then building onto it, I think is an easier way to create form with these water soluble oil paints. So now, as promised, as we approach the nose, there's going to be more light, and thus it's going to be looking much brighter. And so we put in that light plane for the nasal bone of the nose. Now we're working our way down to the bulb of the nose, and with less pressure, I'm adding less paint into the bottom of the nose here. Notice with more pressure and a little more paint, I added that the highlight onto the bulb of the nose. Now I want to work each major plane in relation to one another. So now I'm going to be using a little bit of ultramarine blue into these flesh tones that I created. Now the flesh tones are very much just a combination of cadmium red, yellow ochre, burnt umber, and zinc white. And I'm not really thinking too much about the large color differences just yet. But now I'm going to start to kind of think about the changes in the hue. So I used a little more ultramarine blue into this area. So this plane right here, I perceive to be a little bit cooler. So now the model was photographed under natural light. So the light is going to be very cold. It's going to be a cool light. So that's going to be meaning that I might have to use a little more ultramarine blue with the lights. Now I'm using a very limited palette here just because I've been slowly collecting these water solubles. I didn't want to buy them all at once. So within this color palette, you do have the Zorn palette, which is going to be extremely useful for the flesh tone mixtures. So that is the white, the red, the ochre, and the black. So those are very useful for creating these flesh tone mixtures. But I also have in there a cadmium yellow and an ultramarine blue, which I think are kind of important for getting these types of colors, such as this one right here, which is going to be a more greenish tone that you wouldn't be able to get as easily with the black and the yellow ochre, though that creates a very beautiful yellow. I think having a cadmium yellow in there really does make a difference in terms of the depth of the greens that you can achieve. So now on this side of the palette, I just picked up a little bit of a cooler halftone right here. And so I'm going to paint in the side plane right here. This is the side plane of the nose. It's angled a little bit further away from the light, so therefore it's getting a little bit darker. So now with a little more of the ultramarine blue into this area of the palette, I'm going to paint in that light that I'm seeing on the eye socket to the left of your screen. And so now I'm trying to work on the other side. So from one eye socket to the other eye socket, there's a little bit of light there as well. So now here's another plane directly beneath the bottom of the lower eyelid. And so now we're going to move our way up on the value scale. So we're going to make this halftone a little bit lighter as we approach the side of the nose. So this area here, the value is very similar to the left side of the screen, the left side of the nose relative to your screen. It's just a little bit lighter. Now I'm working these large planes in relation to one another, but I'm also thinking about them structurally. So this area right here is lighter because the structure of the mouth kind of protrudes forward. It's also referred to as the muzzle of the mouth. So that's what that light plane is doing beneath the bottom of the nose. Now there's a little more light on the zygomatic bone right here, and I perceive it to be a little cooler. So I used a little more of the ultramarine blue into that mixture. And now I'm just going to adjust the edge between these two shapes here. So this is the top plane of the cheekbone into the side plane of the cheek. And just with a little less pressure, we have a softer edge there. And I'm going to utilize the tone of my canvas as much as possible and wherever possible. So I like working usually on a kind of a grayish toned canvas, just so I have room to go lighter or to go darker, and to go warmer or to go cooler. So that's why I like having kind of that neutral gray tone. For instance, this area here is going to be a lot lighter. It's going to be the other side of the frontal area of the muzzle of the mouth. And this entire plane right here on the cheekbone, I'm kind of exaggerating that planar change just to try to create a little more depth for the forms. So now here we have some of the zinc white into the cooler mixture on the palette. Now we have a little bit of light emanating here for the top of the upper lip. Now we're going to add a little bit more of the cadmium red with the halftones here, and then we're going to follow through on the other side of the mouth and add just a little more light in this area right here. And so even at this stage, it's important to keep standing back and to make sure that these values are fitting in relation to one another. So here's one side of the muzzle of the mouth, and it's receiving less light, so it's kind of a side plane but not as dark. So that's how I relate one shape to another shape. This shape is a little bit lighter right here, so I'm going to use a little bit more of the zinc white and a little bit more of the greenish tones. I see this plane here to be a little bit cooler in relation to the surrounding planes. Not sure why. I tell you what, try to use your peripheral vision when comparing shapes of color. So that is looking at the nose, focusing on the nose to observe what color the cheeks are, or looking at the forehead to examine the color of the nose. Try to use your peripheral vision so that you can compare one side of the face to another side of the face. Now with the cooler mixture here on the side plane of the face, this area right here, notice it's directly on the corner of the zygomatic bone, on the corner of the cheekbone, and it's approaching the mandible. That plane, that entire plane there, you can think of it as one just chop. See, I'm working on the other side of the face. This whole area here is turning away from the light in a very uniform fashion from one side of the face to the other side of the face. This entire plane is getting darker, but it's also getting cooler in relation to the surrounding planes. So first thing you might want to notice is that the value is getting darker. The next thing you'd want to notice is that the color is getting cooler in relation to the surrounding colors. And that kind of tends to happen a lot in natural light. Not to give you a formula, but usually the cheekbone area within natural light, that is natural light that's kind of above the forehead, the cheekbone area is going to be a little bit cooler. The forehead is going to be a little bit more on the yellowish side, and the cheekbones are going to be a little bit more on the pinkish side. We can think of those as color bands. So the forehead color band is a little bit more on the yellowish side. The cheekbone band is a little bit more on the pinkish side. Notice the pink that I'm going to add onto the lips here. It's kind of similar to the pink that I added a little bit onto the cheekbones. So those are kind of color bands or color zones, if you will. So now that we have these lights on the flesh, another thing I should note is that I still haven't added a darker value than the burnt umber. Now, why is that? It's not because I'm using the water solubles, it's because I'm purposefully not trying to add in any darker darks yet. I'm trying to maintain the burnt umber value as long as possible, and I'm also stylizing a little bit. I will admit I'm stylizing by leaving the warmth of the burnt umber, and I'm going to let the warmth of the burnt umber show through into the later stages of the painting, just because I like the aesthetic of it. That's the only reason, to be honest. And so now this plane here of the glabella, I'm adjusting its value. I perceive it to be a little bit darker than what I had before. Notice there are color notes on the face. So one note you can look at is the bluish color on the side of the nose on the left side of your screen. So that is that bluish note on the side of the nose. Also on the right side of the model. So on the model, relative to the model, on her right side, there is a bluish note, just trying to clarify that. And then across from it, we have a more pinkish note on the cheek, and then on the forehead, it's a little bit more on the pinkish yellowish side, but still rather cool. And so now we're going to move on to the sclera. So the sclera is the white of the eye. And I should say, as I usually say, the sclera is not white, but notice the paintbrush there has a very bluish tone. So again, I'm kind of stylizing here. I like to have the sclera a lot cooler than the flesh tones. So I actually just used ultramarine blue and the zinc white. And that was it. That's what I used for the color for the sclera. And so now I'm going to put that color in to the surrounding side, but with less pressure. And with less pressure, I'm also making the value not as bright. So that is the advantage of working on a tone, because with more pressure, you can make something a different value than it would be with less pressure. So now I'm going to be painting in a color here for the pupil. So this area here is going to be a little bit cooler. So I used a combination of the cadmium yellow and the ivory black for this area here. Now as we are moving closer to the top of the eye, I'm pretty much just using burnt umber and ivory black to get that dark accent. So again, kind of stylizing a little bit in that I'm now starting to place my darker darks, but very strategically, I'm trying to place them in areas of focus. So the area of focus is certainly going to be the eyes, so that's why I placed in that dark there. And so now with a little more of the cadmium yellow and ultramarine blue, I'm going to put in a more greenish tone here for this area of the eye. And I'm going to go in with the other side. So again, still working both sides of the face side by side. Bilateral symmetry is a very beautiful element that we human beings have. And you can see bilateral symmetry pretty much everywhere. I mean, your cat is symmetrical, your dog is symmetrical, a starfish is symmetrical. Now, I will say that we do deviate in terms of our symmetry. For example, I have one eye that's a little bit lower than the other eye, and one ear on myself that's a little bit lower than the other ear. So all of us, we do have kind of variations. We do have variations in terms of our symmetry. They're usually very slight. In any case, so with the eyes here, I'm working both sides in relation to one another. Again, employing that bilateral symmetry on the portrait. So after placing in those darks, I'm going to go in with a lighter mixture. And so I'm going to go in and start to place the highlights. So I'm going to be using just the Zinc White and the Ultramarine blue, and just a tad bit of ultramarine blue. So pretty much 98% Zinc White, 2% of ultramarine blue. So we have one highlight, and let's add a little bit on the other side for another highlight. Very simply there, just a single brush stroke for the highlight. And when you're trying to build a focal point, it's a good idea to put in a sharp edge and a very contrasting value differentiation. So the highlight right on top of that dark along with the sharp edge on the top of the eyes, is starting to create a more refined focal point. And so now we're going to add a little bit of light here for the top plane of the lower eyelid. And again, that mixture was pretty much just the cadmium red, yellow ochre, and the zinc white. Very simple brush stroke there. Try to economize as much as you can. I barely put that much information into the eyes. And just a little brush stroke right here for the other side of the eye will give the illusion of that form. Now let's get into some of the background. Why not? I almost wanted to leave it looking like this, kind of loose and lots of burnt umber everywhere. Almost wanted to leave it like that, but I decided let's start to put in some values for the background. So I'm starting off with my darkest dark. And again, I left it in burnt umber, or I left the darks in burnt umber as long as possible, so that when the time came for me to want to add more variation with the darks, I have a lot of room to make changes. So I started with the darkest dark, using ultramarine blue and burnt umber. And I will say, even when you get into the darkest darks of your portraits or your still lives or landscapes, try not to use straight black. Anything that's straight black, just like anything that is straight white, notice with the highlights I said I used a little bit of the ultramarine blue. Anything that's straight black or anything that's straight white kind of tends to jump out at you. And you don't want anything to jump out of your portrait. You want it to harmonize. You want everything to be very harmoniously orchestrated on your canvas. Or not. If you want things to jump out, go in there with a palette knife and Ivory Black and make your mark if that's what you really want to do. But I didn't want to do that with this one. So I'm using the burnt umber and the ultramarine blue, and I'm kind of scumbling the color onto the dark shape of the hair, maybe making it too blue at first, but I'll go back in there with some more burnt umber here. And I will admit, I did use a little bit of water to thin out the paint for this area here. Notice it's kind of a little more fluid now. Be very careful with water-soluble oil paints. Be careful with the water. I can't emphasize this enough. It is not as forgiving as regular oil paints in terms of thinning it out. Once you thin the paint out too much, you're going to want to clean off that brush or set it aside and change brushes because these chemists did a wonderful job in creating these oil paints that thin out with water. I think they only changed like a single molecule or something. Not that I know any science, but scientists altered the oil paint very slightly in such a way that it thins out with water, but they did a great job because water cleans off the oil paint. I mean, really cleans it off. So just a tiny bit helps with the fluidity of the paint, but I would stick to using a medium to try and get the paint to be more thin. So that large brush you saw me use just there was my fan brush, and that fan brush I usually use to eliminate glare, but in this instance I used it to kind of soften the edge on the corner of the jawbone. So now I'm going to go in with the ultramarine blue and try to put in a darker accent here. So the dark accent is going to be the division between one structure and another structure. So the structures that I'm trying to separate are this collar here for the sweater that the model is wearing, and her neck that is in shadow. So I wanted to separate those two, so I put in that dark accent first. So now with a different brush, I'm using ultramarine blue with cadmium red to try to get a type of purple for this area. Now I will admit, I really wanted my alizarin crimson. I wish that I had purchased alizarin crimson in water solubles, because alizarin crimson with a touch of white and then a tiny bit of ultramarine blue gives you a wonderful purple. And cadmium red and ultramarine blue can give you kind of decent purple, such as the one that I'm using here for this collar. But I did really want my alizarin crimson here, and so now I'm just working the edge between the corner of the neck, just trying to differentiate one corner from the other corner. So again, working with my large color masses side by side to try and get a change not only in color but in value. So now I'm adding in a little bit more color here to the bottom of the collar, and I just want to abbreviate it, just maybe 3 values for this area of clothing. Just 3 or 4 values can really read pretty well at a distance. And another thing that I should say as I start to add in these shapes is that we're not trying to copy what we're looking at in front of us. It's called a photo reference for a reason. The word reference is in there because we're referring to it. It's not called a photocopy. It's not called a photo map. It's called a photo reference. We're trying to interpret what we're looking at, and through our own interpretation, through our own narrative, we create beautiful and unique brushstrokes that are unique to us. Every one of you has a very distinct and unique touch, just like everyone has a very distinct, just like every individual person has a distinct handwriting, if I can even word that properly. Every person has their own touch, is what I'm trying to say. So now with just a little bit of ultramarine blue and a little bit of the cadmium red and a ton of the white, pretty much almost all of it, and this large size 10 flat brush, I'm going to try and get the light for the light side of the shirt. But first, I just realized I needed to put in the little bit of a dark here for the bottom of the collar. And you'll see this type of abbreviation in a lot of portrait paintings, where a collar can be painted in just 2 tones. A dark shape for the shadow side of the collar, and then a large sweeping brushstroke for the light side of the collar. It's very much an aesthetic thing, but it does tend to work out fairly well. So I just put in the dark there for the shadow side of the collar, and I'm going to cover up this side of the collar, and then I'm going to come back into it with the white, maybe just showing 1 or 2 brush strokes there. So here we go. Lots of paint. Very fun to paint in this kind of way. We're just throwing the paint on there. Here's going to be just a single brush stroke right there. Single brush stroke time. Just a very simple brush stroke. And let's carry that idea onto this side. Check it out. Just a single brush stroke. I tell you, this is loads of fun. It's lots of fun to paint with a loaded brush and tons of paint in this kind of fashion. Maybe just a touch more of the ultramarine blue for this area right here. And be very mindful of what bits of information you show, and try not to show everything. Just tiny traces of information. With the ultramarine blue and the white, I'm just putting in a little glimpse of a halftone here on the corner of the collar. Very simple brush stroke. That collar is pretty much 3 brush strokes that are showing, is giving us the shape of the collar there. And so now I'm gonna get some of the dark off the palette and start to strategically place in some of the darks into the face. So I'm starting off with the eyebrows. Again, I'm very cosmetically oriented with this painting. I'm kind of stylizing it a fair amount. So with the darks, I pretty much started off with areas of focus. Notice I'm putting in that dark there for the eyebrows. Now I'm going to put in another dark here for the bottom accent of the lower lip. And again, the accent is an area where one structure meets another structure. So that is the bottom of the lip met with the chin. And now another accent here for the top of the lower lip meeting with the bottom of the upper lip. The mouth is slightly open. You can barely see it. And I really love that type of expression. I really like portrait paintings where the model is kind of looking off to the side and the mouth is just slightly open. Kind of gives that awkward kind of gesture. It's a very awkward look, but I like painting things that are slightly unusual or slightly awkward. Now I'm saying that the gesture is slightly awkward, but the model is not, so don't interpret me, don't falsely interpret me, please. This model is very beautiful, and the gesture that she's making by looking up and with the mouth a little bit open is a very different type of gesture. In any case, now I'm adding in some of the dark accents for the nose here. So just a few little brush strokes here for the nostril. I'm going to add just a little more dark to the other side so we can get the other nostril. And I think I'm going to push the color differences a little bit more. So I added in a little bit more warmth to the bottom of the nose, just a little more warmth. Now I'm going to go in with a darker value. I'm going to rest my pinky on the panel here, and I'm just going to try to make this cast shadow a little bit darker. Form shadow on the nose is a little bit warmer and not as dark, but the cast shadow, that is the shadow of the nose being casted onto the face, is going to be a little bit darker in value. And I'm kind of exaggerating that value change. Like I said before, I'm kind of stylizing this portrait a little bit. So here's a little bit more light here for the corner of the side of the upper lip. And I'm going to add even more light right here just to sharpen this edge on the corner of the nose. And at this point of the painting, I really don't notice a difference anymore between the water-soluble paints and the regular oil paints. I will say they handle very, very similarly. Now again, water-soluble oil paints are oil paints. They are oil paints, but the only difference is that the scientists work their magic so that it thins out with water and cleans very easily. So now I'm going in with a different brush here for the background. I decided to put in something for the background. So I'm using ultramarine blue and a fair amount of it, and some of the cadmium yellow and yellow ochre, just a tiny bit, and some ivory black is going to go into that. So just a little bit of ivory black for that, and maybe a touch more of the cadmium yellow. And these colors are they hold their own pretty well. If you're going to try and compare it to regular oil paints, the intensity of the color is actually pretty good. And I will say, depending on where you're purchasing the water-soluble oil paints. I probably shouldn't talk about this, but they're cheaper. Let's just say that. Let's just put it this way. The water-soluble oil paints are cheaper. So maybe you'll probably see me use more of these water-soluble paints for these demonstrations. I don't know. But I really do like how they handle. They're fairly inexpensive and they're easy to clean up. So now with the background, I'm just adding some variation to the background. So I used a little bit more Ivory Black and Cadmium Yellow, and I'm adding a different color here for this region of the background. So there is a very distinct plane change in the background. So sometimes adding a little bit of variation to the background colors rather than just having a flat color in the background can kind of do some positive things in terms of the aesthetics of the painting. Just adding a little bit of variation. Now I know aesthetics is a very subjective term. So in any case, it just makes it a little more interesting when you add some more bits of information into the background. And so I just adjusted the color of the hair a little bit, and I'm going to try and add a little bit of a darker value. And again, I'm kind of contrasting the dark of the hair with the light on the face, so kind of pushing the light and dark differences between the two. And let's push a little bit more dark up here on the corner of the top of the head. Now with the head, you can with the hair, you can think of it just like the planes of the face. Notice that the hair on the bottom is a little bit lighter and the hair on the top is a little bit darker. Very much distinct plane changes. So now I'm going to take a little bit of the flesh tone. So you may have seen me do this a lot in the other painting videos. So I actually tend to take some of the colors for the flesh tones and use them for the lights onto the hair. Especially with the highlights of the hair, I wouldn't err on the cooler side. Depends on the model, of course. But with this type of hairstyle, using the flesh tones for the highlights of the hair might be an easier way to go. And I know that there's still some of the burnt umber showing within certain areas of the painting, but I'm going to leave some of the burnt umber to show just because I like that kind of look, kind of like an old master look where you see the underpainting showing through. That's the kind of aesthetic that I like. And I also like pushing the warmth in between shapes of color and value. And so now I'm thinking that I'm going to modify the color a little bit. So I'm using a little bit more cadmium red. So I'm going to push this area of the color a little bit warmer than I see it. So the ear that is in shadow, I'm going to contrast the warmth of it in relation to the cooler notes in the background and in the surrounding flesh tones. And now I'm going to add a little bit more light here for the light plane of the hair. Just a little bit more light to kind of help push the form. And again, at this point, I did use a little bit of water to dilute the paint. I know at first I said be very careful with it. You can use trace amounts of the water to dilute the paint, but very sparingly, extremely sparingly use them. And now with the Ivory Black and back to the dark brush, I'm going to use Ivory Black and Ultramarine Blue and just add a little bit more variation into the background. this doesn't really need to be there, and it doesn't serve any purpose other than aesthetics. I just wanted a dark shape there, and I put it there. No other reason for it. Now then, it wouldn't be a portrait painting if there wasn't something wrong with the mouth. So I'm thinking that the corner of this side of the mouth needs to cut in a little bit more. So I'm just fuzzing it out with this watercolor brush. I'm just going to fuzz it out a little bit more. And so the way I'm going to correct the mouth is by blurring out one side. So notice I just blurred out that side. So now I'm going to come in with some Ivory Black and Cadmium Red, and I'm going to reapply the dark accent between the two shapes. And then of course I'm going to modulate the values as they turn in closer to that accent. So notice right here it's going to get a little bit lighter on the corner of the side of the mouth. Just a little bit lighter here as this plane is facing the light even more. And this plane here is facing the light even more as well, but very small touches here to correct the mouth. Again, the correction was just to push that corner of the mouth a little bit closer to the middle of the mouth. I had a little too much of it showing. So now back in there with the watercolor brush, just to blur out that edge. I tend to use watercolor brushes, very soft watercolor brushes, to modulate the edges, to make them a little softer. Kind of helps to blend them around a little bit, but not too much. I'd be careful not to overblend a certain area. So now I'm going to go back to just reestablish that dark, just to make sure that it's fitting properly with the surrounding shapes of the mouth. And it's important to soften edges, particularly around the features, like the corner of the eyes, the nose, and the mouth, softening them. It's just kind of an aesthetic touch, really. Again, I did stylize a little bit with this one, just softening certain edges. And with that, we have the conclusion of this week's portrait painting demonstration. I really hope that this video helps you out. And again, I apologize that I had to go back to my old camera angle. I did have problems with my microphone, so hopefully I'll be able to get a better quality microphone that I can clip onto my shirt so that I can move my head freely and talk to you while I'm creating these paintings. But in any case, I really hope that this video helps you out. I hope that you try out water-soluble oil paints. They're definitely a lot of fun. They do take some getting used to, but I think you'll find that you will really enjoy them. Thank you so much for watching, and I wish you the best in all of your artwork, and I'll see you on the next video.